August 1992. In a gloomy hotel room, a former Nazi lives sick and in hiding. Stricken with cancer, he knows better than anybody that he is dying. He used to be a doctor. Under the Third Reich, Aribert Heim had been an archetypal Nazi, the incarnation of power, cruelty, and terror. Now, he's but a shadow of his former self.
It was as though he was some character out of a James Bond movie, but the villain, not the hero.
Aribert Heim, one of history's most terrifying Nazi criminals. An SS doctor during World War II, nicknamed Dr. Death.
It was better not to go to the infirmary. People died there.
At Mauthausen concentration camp, witnesses described acts of unbearable barbarity.
This person was really a terrible sadist, someone who was motivated by a deep sense of cruelty.
This young doctor with no medical experience operated on nearly 300 prisoners. The operations were often fatal.
Aribert Heim was known for injecting gasoline directly into the hearts of inmates in order to kill them.
In other words, they came to him to be helped, and he murdered them.
Fascinated by Adolf Hitler, whose initials he shared, he identified with what the Reich claimed to be the Aryan physique and Aryan superiority.
He wasn't the kind of person that people forget easily.
But after the war, this criminal mysteriously escaped justice. He started a family and continued to practice medicine without even taking the precaution of changing his identity.
He didn't hide. He was even listed in the telephone directory. If anyone had wanted to find him, they could have found him.
But when the noose started to tighten around Aribert Heim, he disappeared and his name went near the top of the list of the world's most wanted Nazis.
I did everything that I could. I went to travel to the end of the earth.
He escaped notice.
Who was Aribert Heim? This is the story of the terrifying Dr. Death. Mauthausen, 1941. One of the Third Reich's most murderous concentration camps. Aribert Heim was a young SS member among many others. It was here he began his doctor's career. And yet in this infirmary, he would make a reputation for himself in just 6 weeks. This young doctor, fresh out of medical school, was to mark the history of this concentration camp with his sadism and cruelty.
He murdered inmates, he tortured people, killed people.
Aribert Heim carried out nearly 300 operations during which inmates often died in atrocious pain. The operations were barbaric.
He carried out atrocious murders. He operated on living patients and killed them during these operations. These patients had no chance of survival. He did horrible things.
These were, of course, criminal experiments because inmates were used as guinea pigs. Because for the Nazis, they were nothing other than guinea pigs.
Aribert Heim was passionate about anatomy, about skulls in particular.
He was also known for keeping the skull of one of his victims, which he had boiled to remove the flesh, and he kept it on his desk like a paperweight or a souvenir.
Here, at Mauthausen, the young man became, in a short lapse of time, a veritable executioner at the heart of a racist and anti-Semitic system. A system that encouraged violence towards Jews, disabled people, homosexuals, and anyone who opposed the regime. An ideology that would claim 5 million victims across Europe by establishing veritable killing centers. To understand the bloody destiny of this Nazi doctor, you have to go back another 30 years. The 28th of June, 1914. The story of Aribert Heim, the future Dr. Death, started on that dark day. The first day of the First World War, which plunged Europe into several years of bloody conflict. It was that day that Aribert Heim was born in a small town in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the region at the heart of the conflict.
Aribert Heim was born on the same day that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was killed, which is what started World War I. And that would end up having an effect on Aribert Heim's life as well, because after World War I, the town that he was born in was split in half, part of it in Yugoslavia and part of it in Austria.
Aribert Heim's home region was profoundly marked by this conflict.
People there became more radical, became more nationalist, and many of them supported the causes that became the Nazi causes.
Between the end of World War I and the 1930s, the young Aribert grew up in a defeated country, hit hard by the economic crisis. A malaise that nourished a movement that came from Germany, Nazism. In this neighboring country, one man used this despair to conquer power in record time: Adolf Hitler. He became Chancellor the 30th of January 1933 and established the Third Reich, a totalitarian dictatorship. In Austria, Aribert Heim was 19 years old. Fascinated by the Nazi party that had been banned in his country, the young man covertly found out everything he could about it. He followed the unrolling of its political program by Adolf Hitler in Germany. A racist ideology that galvanized the crowds and restored hope to a people in crisis. An ideology where the Jew became enemy number one in the name of the purification of the race.
The crucial moment was the passing of the September 1935 laws, villainous laws that stripped those defined as Jewish of their German nationality.
Laws of exclusion whose aim was to separate Jews from the rest of society. To back up this racist ideology, Hitler needed as much credible evidence as he could get. One pillar of support upon which Hitler would lean heavily was science.
Medicine had a very important role to play in this context because it provided part of the scientific, some would say pseudoscientific foundations for this ideology.
For Hitler and the other Nazi leaders, the German doctor was, by his very definition, a soldier of biology.
This ideology was based, among other things, on anatomical measurements aimed at creating the perfect Aryan. And anatomy was Aribert Heim's passion. He studied it as a medical student at the renowned University of Vienna.
This was one of the most important medical schools in the world at the time still. It was one of the world centers of medicine. In the 20s, 30s, there were still people coming from the United States on stipends to polish their skills.
In this faculty, Aribert Heim met someone who would change his life. His anatomy professor, Dr. Edward Pernkopf. He was, at that time, an enthusiastic supporter of the Nazi regime.
Dr. Eduard Pernkopf was a famous anatomist, but also a very diehard Nazi. And he would lecture the students wearing his brown SA uniform. That helped set the tone at the university in the Nazi year.
Aribert Heim began by studying Latin, and after that pursued his medical studies under Professor Edward Pernkopf, who was in charge of the Anatomy Institute. Alongside this professor, Aribert Heim developed a keen interest in dissection. His studies focused very much on human bodies, and he was able to practice on numerous corpses.
The young student looked up to Dr. Pernkopf. This professor, who was the author of a renowned atlas of the human body published after the war, an atlas that is controversial today, which would be closely linked with the horrors of Nazism.
So this is a copy of the famous anatomical atlas by Eduard Pernkopf. Some people tell me that they still use it in the United States and other countries. So this is a really important and also very controversial piece of medical science. Because what came out starting from the beginning of the 90s is that there was a certain suspicion that they could be concentration camp inmates.
Surrounded by Nazi students and professors, Aribert Heim threw himself heart and soul into this ideology. The young man identified with the Aryan archetype described by Adolf Hitler. His physique corresponded perfectly with the criteria the Führer praised. Indeed, the young Aribert was particularly tall and charismatic. He was a very accomplished sportsman. The cult of the body was a veritable obsession for him.
Aribert Heim was a large man. He was 193 centimeters. He had very broad shoulders. He was muscular. He was also very handsome. He wasn't the kind of person that people forget easily, which would be important later in his story.
He was physically imposing. He played in defense in the ice hockey team. He was in Vienna's champion team.
There are still old newspaper clippings from the time that talk about what a great ice hockey player he was.
In 1936, a famous Austrian newspaper praised the young Aribert to the skies for his sporting talents. At that time in his life, Aribert Heim could have chosen to lead a brilliant career as a professional ice hockey player. But, fascinated by Hitler, he chose politics instead. His exceptional physique was of considerable help when he joined the SS, the Führer's elite paramilitary group.
It's clear that when you wanted to join the SS, for example, which was very demanding, when it came to appearance as well as family history, being tall, blonde, and in good health, being a top sportsman, for example, was ideal when it came to representing the German who would conquer the world.
Conquer the world, but also eliminate undesirables. It was precisely the SS that he was hoping to join that would, later on, be charged with the execution of the final solution and the murder of millions of innocent people. The 12th of March, 1938. Adolf Hitler annexes Austria, the Anschluss. This decision had major repercussions in Aribert Heim's native country. From that point on, the government of Austria would be the same as the government of Nazi Germany. The repression of the Jews and all opponents of the regime gripped the country. Heim exulted. He had been fascinated by Nazism for several years. Now at last, events seemed to reinforce his convictions.
What you can tell for Aribert Heim is that he was convinced Nazi from the beginning, so there is no way of calling him just someone who went with the mainstream, like so many Austrians did after 1938, after the so-called Anschluss, but he really was part of the party in 1935.
In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. The start of the Second World War. Aribert Heim wasn't mobilized straight away, but obtained an exemption in order to complete his studies. It was only 1 year later, in 1940, that he joined the Waffen-SS. Aribert Heim began his doctor's career in the middle of the war. He was not sent to the front, however. He was posted to a place where he might practice his sadism with total impunity. A concentration camp. Sachsenhausen Camp, less than 20 miles north of Berlin, April 1941. Aribert Heim's first posting. Sachsenhausen was a model camp, a shop window for the Reich. Its architecture was designed to show Nazi supremacy.
Sachsenhausen had the particularity of being laid out as a triangle, which permitted the surveillance of the whole detention camp from a central point at the summit of the triangle.
It was here that Aribert Heim familiarized himself with the violence of the concentration camp system. Although he remained for the time being in the shadows, the doctor discovered that, for the Nazi, everything was permitted. Inmates' deaths and the first experiments with gassing made a deep impression on him. And it was only a short time later, in a camp in Austria, that Aribert Heim truly became the Doctor of Death. October 1941. The young Aribert Heim is sent here to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. He's 27. At this date, Hitler has not yet opened the extermination camps in Poland. Mauthausen was therefore the only level 3 camp, the maximum level of terrible harshness.
This was the entrance to the Mauthausen concentration camp, a preventative internment center. In Mauthausen camp, 200,000 people were interned between 1938 and 1945.
We can say that a little over half the people interned in Mauthausen died, which made it, in the concentration camp category, the harshest in occupied Europe.
During the period when the camp was at its fullest, some prisoners said 800 people, 1,000 even, were packed into these huts.
One of the camp's last survivors was 17 at the time of his internment there. He was a member of the French resistance. Bernard Mangot remembers the nightmare he lived through.
We were slaves, more precisely numbers. Never, not once, did anyone call me by my name. I was 62.739. 62,739. My friends died one after the other.
The prisoners were made to submit to forced labor. The camp was built next to a granite quarry where detainees had to fetch the heavy stones destined for different Reich building projects. Every day, weighed down with these heavy stones, prisoners had to climb a steep flight of steps.
It was hell for anyone who dropped his stone, because he would be beaten. For anyone who fell, well, he was trampled by the others, after which he was given another load to carry if he was still alive. It was so savage, all that.
A flight of steps called the Death Steps. When Aribert Heim arrived in this concentration camp in October 1941, Mauthausen was in flux. The number of prisoners was rising exponentially following the German army's invasion of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the summer of 1941. The SS decided they needed to clean Mauthausen, which is to say, eliminate a large number of prisoners.
Almost all of the murders at Mauthausen were carried out in order to make room in the camp, and were made on the basis of who was ill, who was not ill.
And the elimination of prisoners took place to a large extent in the camp infirmary the Germans called the Revier.
It was best not to go to the infirmary because the infirmary didn't save anybody. You died there.
The people who worked at camps like Mauthausen had little or no regard for human life.
At that date, the death camps didn't yet exist. At Mauthausen, extermination had not yet been industrialized. The doctors would therefore be required to make their personal contribution to the killing process.
There weren't any gas chambers yet at Mauthausen, so the order was given to the SS doctors to execute people. But these executions had to be carried out with SS order, if I might put it that way, which is to say that you don't just kill people, you make a note of it. You give it a name, you make up a fictional illness, you give it a date, you draw up lists.
At the time when Aribert Heim worked at the camp, in autumn 1941, around 50 detainees died each day at Mauthausen and its annex camp. You have to understand that, at this period, the project of systematic destruction of human life was being perfected.
SS doctors would be free to kill who they wanted, when they wanted.
In other words, people went to be healed. They went to his infirmary thinking that they were going to be treated by a doctor. Instead, what happened was the opposite. In other words, they came to him to be helped, and he murdered them.
The essential function of the SS doctors at Mauthausen was to kill.
In this concentration camp, Aribert Heim was therefore able, with total impunity, to commit the most dreadful murders. The marriage of a killer instinct and Nazi ideology gave birth to a bloody and barbarous monster. That the young Aribert had no experience when he arrived in the camp wasn't a problem. On the contrary.
It was quite normal for young doctors to get sent to concentration camps because it was a way to gain experience.
He was not very high up in the SS hierarchy. But this was of no importance when it came to working as a doctor. The important thing was that he was a doctor and a member of the SS. His rank was of no consequence at that time.
You could ask yourself why these people were lunatics and murderers. Above all, they were people who were protecting themselves from being sent to the Eastern Front and who were so spineless that, to hold on to their position, they were prepared to obey any order.
Aribert Heim only stayed at Mauthausen for 6 weeks, but his cruelty would mark those who survived the camp forever. Dr. Death showed himself capable of the most extreme inhumanity. Heim had a very precise procedure that was always the same. Like a serial killer, the doctor chose his targets among the prisoners methodically.
Witnesses who survived the Mauthausen concentration camp said that Dr. Heim would operate on perfectly healthy patients, resulting in their deaths, that he was almost performing personal medical experiments on them.
Aribert Heim brought inmates to the infirmary for operations they often didn't need. After the war, the survivors recounted the details of these crimes.
There exists a testimony written by a survivor where he answers an interviewer's questions. Dr. Heim examined prisoners' mouths to see if their teeth were perfect. If they were, he'd kill them by lethal injection. Then he'd cut off their head. He'd put it in the crematorium for several hours until the skull was completely bare. Then he would prepare the skull for himself and his friends as a decoration for their offices.
And the horror didn't stop there. Eviscerations, dissections, amputations of healthy legs. His murderous injections made him notorious in the camp.
Aribert Heim was known for injecting gasoline directly into the hearts of inmates in order to kill them.
And after each operation, the man they called Dr. Death performed the same ritual. He meticulously measured the time it took for the patient to die. Sometimes the camp doctors continued their experiments in the autopsy room.
It was here, in what was the autopsy room, that SS doctors carried out dissections of deceased prisoners, examinations and medical experiments.
At Mauthausen, Aribert Heim stood out also by a peculiar habit. As keen on sport as ever, The young doctor was quite capable, in the same day, of executing a man before going off to practice his favorite pastime.
Several inmates who worked in the infirmary with Dr. Heim remembered that he would leave to play ice hockey during his free time. He could be operating in a concentration camp 1 minute and skating on the ice the next.
Aribert Heim's operations only represent a small number of the 100,000 crimes carried out at Mauthausen during the war. But Dr. Death's murders were special. They were carried out in cold blood with the greatest cruelty.
There's no evidence that the crimes that Aribert Heim committed were medical experiments that were ordered by his superiors. Instead, it appears to be something that he did himself. Some of the doctors who survived the concentration camp as inmates said that it seemed to be something that was done to practice surgical skills, or sometimes out of cruelty, and even scariest in some ways, they said sometimes out of boredom.
Some of them came with seemingly minor complaints, and he performed major surgery on them without anesthesia, and he murdered some of them. This guy was really, really a terrible sadist.
Survivors like Joseph Kohl and Karl Kaufmann described Aribert Heim as extremely cruel and even sadistic in the way that he spoke with and handled the people who would ultimately become his victims.
You have to distinguish between formal experiments that were funded by central agencies in Germany and in the German Reich, and between killings that were done in the Mauthausen concentration camp.
Other doctors operated on prisoners with the same barbarity as Heim. Here, in the Auschwitz camp, the famous Dr. Joseph Mengele tortured twins and gypsies in 1943, 2 years after Heim. The only difference? Mengele carried out these medical experiments for the Reich in the name of pseudoscientific research. Aribert Heim did it for himself.
He took pleasure in torturing the inmates of Mauthausen. Innocent people who the only reason they were in Mauthausen was because they were people who had been categorized as enemies of the Third Reich. In other words, the Germans created false categories of criminality.
A cruel man for whom it is difficult, even today, to know the extent of his crimes or the exact number of his victims.
It's difficult to say how many people Aribert Heim killed. There's the operation book that gives a list of the patients that he performed procedures on, and there's a notation when some of those patients died. But it is believed that the patients that were anesthetized, that were killed with injections to the heart with gasoline, would not have turned up in the operation book and therefore would not be counted.
Dr. Heim acted like a serial killer. A killer who masks his crimes. SS doctors knew that their acts could be held against them after the war. So Aribert Heim took care to destroy the evidence after each operation.
You don't have the details, of course, of the real causes of death, because in most cases it's only falsifications that the sources we have are only those that we have, and they are not telling the whole story. They're hiding more than they tell.
If doctors performed operations on inmates who died, it wasn't something that people paid attention to or cared about, because scores of people were dying all the time, and a patient here or a patient there was not someone who was going to be missed in the middle of this Holocaust.
At Mauthausen, Aribert Heim was far from being an isolated criminal. The whole concentration camp system was directed with limitless violence against inmates who were considered in the camps to be subhuman.
Always, there were punishments for anything and everything. For not taking your cap off in front of an SS member, they called it 25. It was 25. 25 blows with a rod, and the man got down on his knees and received 25 blows with a rod. We were animals, in fact. For them, we were part of an inferior race.
If Aribert Heim was able to use such violence with total impunity, it was because his hierarchy shared the same inhumanity. After the war, from March 1946, the men in charge of the Mauthausen camp would be judged by an American military court. Most of the accused were hanged. But not Aribert Heim. Why was Dr. Death spared? The young murderer was lucky to have left Mauthausen so quickly, after only 6 weeks and leaving no traces behind him.
Numerous doctors, like Aribert Heim, moved on after only short spells here. They were always changing their places of work.
It was completely normal for doctors and SS members to be given different postings. You'd arrive somewhere to carry out a mission for a certain duration, and then you'd be sent elsewhere.
November 1941. Aribert Heim was transferred to the Vienna Military Hospital to treat the wounded returning from the front line. 1 year later, his trace was found in another military hospital several thousand kilometers away on the Eastern Front in the Finnish town of Oulu. But as the end of the war approached, the noose began to tighten around Aribert Heim. The 15th of March, 1945, Aribert Heim and his unit are captured by the Americans. Germany is defeated. The country is in ruins. The war, total and global, has left 50 million people dead. The whole world discovers the victims of the camps as the Allies liberate them one by one. Hitler commits suicide in April. Germany must now pay for its crimes. The Allies set about denazifying the country. All the symbols of the Third Reich are destroyed. The trials of senior Nazi officials get underway in Nuremberg in November 1945.
Guilty or not guilty? Nicht schuldig.
Aribert Heim is incarcerated in a prisoner of war camp. At the same moment, Mauthausen survivors start testifying to his cruelty. But these testimonies would have no effect.
During the internment procedure, he was denazified. In other words, checks were carried out on his political past. They probably found out that, yes, he'd been a member of the SS and a camp doctor. They would have known there was evidence against him. And yet the procedure was suspended and Aribert Heim was let out of prison.
Heim was free. Dr. Death was not judged alongside the Mauthausen camp officials at the trial that started in March 1946. In the dock, there were 61 defendants, but no trace of Heim. Dr. Death avoided the scaffold, the fate that awaited the worst Nazi criminals. Mystery surrounds the Aribert Heim affair.
Why wasn't he judged when he was implicated in crimes? Why didn't the Americans bring him to court? Why was he freed from internment? Why was he denazified so easily? Later on, he was able to lead a normal life. These are questions that need answering.
Aribert Heim would never pay for the barbaric crimes he committed in the Mauthausen camp. an injustice explained in part by the general debacle of the defeated country. After the war, Germany was in ruins and in chaos.
Somehow in the confusion with the millions of people, the refugees, the war wounded, he escaped notice.
Germany was incapable of judging all of its Nazi criminals. It concentrated on its own reconstruction.
It was almost like the entire country was trying to forget what had happened and focus instead on rebuilding, on making money, and on material comfort rather than psychological distress.
Perhaps one of the most horrible aspects of the Holocaust was that people who had no criminal backgrounds prior to the war committed the most terrible crimes imaginable during the war, and then went back to being quote-unquote normal people.
Becoming someone normal again. Going back to a peaceful, orderly life. Even after having committed the worst crimes. This is exactly what Aribert Heim did after the war. 1953. Once freed, Aribert Heim settled in Germany and radically changed his life, thanks to a woman he met, Friedel, whom he married. With her, he settled in the well-to-do town of Baden-Baden and started a family. The former Dr. Death did not even bother to hide his identity. He thought he was untouchable.
He didn't change his name, and I think that after he was released from his period as a prisoner of war, I think that he probably believed, and most Nazis believed, that there would be no more justice, that period of history was over for them.
In this context, we can say he led a normal life. He didn't hide. He was even in the telephone directory. If anyone had wanted to find him, they could have found him.
Far from worrying about being arrested, Aribert Heim settled into a peaceful and comfortable life. His wife came from a very wealthy family. A family that enabled them to buy a large house where they raised 2 children.
As this is not the home of a fugitive on the run. This is a house of someone who's very wealthy, who's very well established.
Membership of the bourgeoisie, a model family. It was a long way from the image of the murderous Mauthausen camp doctor and his sordid operations.
For many Nazis, it appears to be something compartmentalized into the period of their lives under Adolf Hitler when such crimes were permitted. The same people who could be turned into willing killers at one point in their lives would go back to living domestic and even boring lives when that was what the rest of the country was doing.
As if nothing had happened during the war, Aribert Heim became a doctor again. He opened a gynecology practice in the center of town.
After the war, we have many examples, people who had murdered or contributed to murder, hundreds of patients. They had no problems of not continuing the career, but restarting the career. And
we spoke with patients of Dr. Heim, and they all thought that he was a very good doctor. He was sought after in his practice. He was considered someone that women wanted to see as their gynecologist.
However, behind the appearance of irreproachability, there were signs that he was taking care not to be recognized.
One thing that people remembered was that he didn't like to be photographed. There's a sense that he may have been avoiding something, or he did not want to have a high profile in a way that might attract too much attention to him.
But the fact that he was almost never photographed means that he was being cautious, I think.
Aribert Heim didn't have that much money himself. It was his wife's family that paid for the splendid villa in Baden-Baden. But he was also careful to save his own money and invested in real estate, in particular an apartment building in Berlin that would come in very handy for him later in his life on the run.
In fact, the tranquility of the former Dr. Death was under threat. For some time, the search for former Nazis had quietly resumed. (1962). 10 years have gone by in the quiet town of Baden-Baden, and Aribert Heim's murderous past was about to float back up to the surface. Since the end of the war, the police had been pursuing their investigations. Now they had matching testimonies from survivors who had seen Aribert Heim commit his atrocities at Mauthausen. The investigation had been long, but now the situation was clear. Heim must be punished for his crimes.
In other words, the West German authorities had collected the information and the evidence sufficient to bring him to justice.
After years of ignoring the crimes from their Nazi past, German authorities began to look for perpetrators again in the late 50s and the early 1960s.
There were Mauthausen survivors still living, and now these former inmates broke their silence. Those who had assisted Aribert Heim during his operations in particular. Those who had been in his company during those 6 murderous weeks were about to become key witnesses in the investigation.
There is, of course, a lot of people who knew Aribert Heim or who saw him working there, who worked as physicians in the camp or as sanitation clerks in the offices of the SS doctors. So they saw Aribert Heim and they knew him and they described him after the war.
The concentration camp registers were examined too, the records of all operations and prisoner deaths. These registers contained vital evidence.
You have a register on the operations in the concentration camp of Mauthausen, and you have, of course, the death registers. The SS really had a kind of bookkeeping of deaths that is the main source of telling the stories of those who died and telling the stories of the crimes of Mauthausen.
But there was one thing that really betrayed Aribert Heim: his unusual physique.
He was very tall, over 6'3". This was crucial during the investigations that took place after 1945. He was very easy to recognize thanks to his height and his general physical aspect.
Aribert Heim, I think, probably thought that he was never going to be prosecuted until one day he was approached by 2 men who wanted to speak with him about his service during the war, and in particular about his time at Mauthausen.
That day, Aribert Heim understood that the perfect life he'd carefully built for himself was about to break into little pieces.
I think that from that moment, he realized that it was likely that they might come after him.
One autumn morning in 1962, Aribert Heim fled his home just before the police came to arrest him. On that day, Dr. Death left his wife and children. He never returned.
He escaped very early in the morning of the day that the police came to arrest him. One of them said it was almost like he was going out the back door as they were coming in the front.
Had Aribert Heim been warned?
Making someone who was about to be arrested disappear and making sure they were protected, travelling to a country from where they would not be extradited, all this was child's play in the 1960s.
For several decades, the search for him went on in Europe, in Switzerland, and in Spain, places where he had contacts. Even in Latin America, in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, where so many former Nazis found refuge after the Second World War. All leads were explored, including those that led to some Arab countries. Aribert Heim became one of the most wanted Nazis in the world. For several decades, no one could lay a hand on Dr. Death. He came to personify the denial of justice. August 1992. In fact, it was on the other side of the Mediterranean, in Egypt, that Aribert Heim was hiding. After reaching Spain and then Morocco, Aribert Heim took refuge in the Egyptian capital. In a gloomy hotel in a poor neighborhood of Cairo, the former Dr. Death hid from the world. He lived his last hours here as he died of cancer. A place where he managed to remain undercover by inventing a new life for himself. This time, he changed his name, converting to Islam. An existence in total contradiction with his past.
It was almost as if Aribert Heim had several different lives in one. His life as a soldier, his life as a doctor after the war, but then also this Egyptian life under a different name, practicing a different religion, speaking a different language, and really only interacting with Egyptian people. Egypt was a destination for some Nazis after the war.
For 30 years, Aribert Heim managed to survive in hiding. But as the investigation moved forward, life became much more difficult.
One, prosecutors convicted him in absentia and took away his apartment building in Berlin. That meant that there was much less money for him to live on. And so even though they didn't catch him, even though they couldn't put him in jail, they did make his life a lot less comfortable.
In exile, far from his own, Aribert Heim finally succumbed to his illness on the 10th of August 1992, without ever having been arrested by the police. All he left behind was an old briefcase full of documents that revealed at last his true identity. A passport, medical dossiers, but also letters that he'd received secretly from his children. Documents discovered too late, over 17 years after his death.
It's likely that the mystery of Aribert Heim never would have been solved if it weren't for the fact that he left behind a brown leather briefcase filled with documents.
A mysterious death that immediately raised doubts. As, to be sure of his death, there was one important thing missing.
Where is the body? Can you show us a body? Can we check the body? Forensics, teeth, DNA. No body.
Although his doctors said that Aribert Heim must have died, there's still some mystery because we do not have a body. Without a body, it is difficult to definitively say, as this man is dead.
Even if the Aribert Heim affair was officially closed after the discovery of this briefcase, the man disappeared, leaving more mysteries than certitudes behind him.
For me, Aribert Heim is a ghost. He totally disappeared, leaving huge grey areas. Everything that happened is wrapped in a mystery. How did such a man, who'd committed such crimes and who had left so many traces and so much evidence behind him, manage to slip secretly away? I don't think this would have been possible without some real protection.
Aribert Heim marked the tragic history of the concentration camps. For the entire world, he became the incarnation of Nazi barbarity and the symbol of those numerous SS members who were never punished for their crimes.
As one of the Nazi perpetrators who was able to elude justice, he evolved in a way into a symbol, the most wanted Nazi war criminal in the world.
Aribert Heim, a symbol of evil, but only one among so many of the demons born of Nazi ideology.
He is an obscure character amidst hundreds of others, and I mean hundreds of others, who were criminals on a similar scale.
Well, the fact that Aribert Heim never was punished for his crimes is a failure of many institutions on many levels, I would say.